Esther, aged 30, and 18-month-old Jessica died when fire swept through their home at Butterfield Avenue, Rathfarnham. Mrs. McCann's body was found lying outside her bedroom. Firemen found Jessica still in her cot. They both died from inhaling carbon monoxide fumes.
I want to start off by saying this is a humdinger of a case. Many twists and turns will lead to the murder of Esther McCann, 30, and her foster daughter Jessica, 18 months, in a house fire on the early morning of the 4th of September 1992. While some things you will see coming, and maybe even you can easily work out who the murderer is, the process he went through to get to his final goal and the lengths he went to protect his reputation and stance in the community is another story altogether. Esther was the youngest of 4 children and was raised in Tranmore, County Waterford, which is a seaside town in the southeast of Ireland. Esther was an artist who met her husband Frank, and they married in August of 1987. They bought a house in Butterfield Avenue, Rathfarnham, Dublin, and settled into married life together. Frank was a solid man, great businessman, and well respected in the community. He was involved in the amateur swimming team in Terranure in Dublin and owned a pub in Blessington, County Wicklow, called the Cooperage, named after his actual previous job as a cooper. A cooper is someone that works for a brewery company, repairing the beer barrels that are damaged, and he worked for Guinness Brewery up until then. He was described as a stable man, but bland, and it was said by family that he wouldn't have been Esther's normal type. But she wanted to get married and have a family, and Frank seemed like a good option. Frank's sister fell pregnant, and it didn't go down well with the McCann family. So Esther and Frank took her in along with baby Jessica when she was born. Almost immediately, Frank's sister could see how much Esther loved Jessica and how they would make great parents. It was a no-brainer. Frank and Esther would adopt Jessica, and her biological mother could watch her grow up and know she was well looked after and happy. In 1991, Esther wanted to make it official and put in an application to the adoption board to have Jessica officially adopted. In 1992, Frank and Esther had been married about 5 years. Business was going well, they were expanding their family, and life was good. But on the 13th of August, Frank would call to the Garda station in Blessington. He reported that he received 3 anonymous phone calls that were threatening to him and Esther. The caller told him on all 3 occasions he'd better have the pub well insured. On the 25th of August, Frank called into the Garda station to report that he received another call, and the person said they knew he had been up to the Garda station, and that he and that other lad across the road may watch themselves from now on. Now, the guy across the road was Mr. Grace, that owned a pub also, called West Wicklow House. On the 3rd of September, Frank contacted the Gardaí once again and said he had received another threat. 2 numbers were circled in red in the pub's local phone directory, one being his number saying burn, and the other being the West Wicklow House pub number saying bastard. The Gardaí called to Mr. Grace in the pub, and he told them he was also getting threatening phone calls. Later on that same day, Frank went to the back of his pub, and "Burn you bastard" was spray painted on the wall. These threats would become very important to the events that were to happen the very next day. On the 4th of September 1992, Esther and Jessica were at home as usual. According to Frank, he was working all day and came home around 10 p.m, watched a movie until 11, and he then headed back to the pub and closed up after 1 a.m. Meanwhile, Esther and Jessica are gone to bed, and a fire breaks out in the kitchen after 1 a.m, and there's an explosion. Some people coming home from a wedding saw the fire and rang the emergency services. When Frank arrives home, he sees chaos and is distraught at the sight of the house on fire, knowing his wife and Jessica are inside. He was determined to save them and even went to climb a ladder to get into the house, and he had to be held back. But it was to no avail. Esther was found dead on the landing outside her bedroom door, obviously attempting to get to Jessica, but was overwhelmed by the smoke. Little Jessica was found in her cot, also dead, with her doty still in her mouth. They were both removed from the house, and it was determined later on that they both died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Because of the threats that Frank had reported and the initial investigation into the fire, they determined this was not a normal house fire, so the Garda Technical Bureau was brought in. The scorching on the walls and smoke damage was significant, especially in the hallway going up the stairs. The scorched damage was white on the walls, and they determined that an accelerant had been used. Outside they found small gas bottles and a torch gun. This, they felt, was arson. After the horrific fire, and while Frank was staying with friends, the threats continued. He received a mass card in the post, and it was signed Reverend Byrne. It was a bad, sinister joke. Frank was so distraught that he collapsed. During the Garda investigation, it was discovered that there had been a number of reports of gas leaks in the house, and An Bord Gáis had been called out. On the 3rd of June, An Bord Gáis were called out, but no leak was found. On the 16th of July, there was a major leak and presence of gas. On the 26th of July, they found nothing again, and on the 28th of July, 2 days later, there was another leak, and it again was a major leak. On this occasion, Frank was at work and Esther woke up, and the house was full of gas. She grabbed Jessica and ran out of the house. She put Jessica in the car. She was afraid to start her car in case it ignited the gas, so she pushed the car out of the driveway and onto the road, and only then did she start it. She drove straight to her sister's house and rang Frank to tell him. All these written reports of gas leaks were looked at by the Bureau, and they found that the gas engineer that fixed the leak on one occasion had put an extra seal on the gas pipe so it wouldn't open. But then when the last leak was reported, the seal had been melted and broken apart. Someone had intentionally done it. Gardaí determined that Frank would be the only one who had access to the house and experience with the blowtorch through his old job. If it was Frank, why would he want Esther and Jessica dead? But there was the threats that Frank was getting. Maybe they had something to do with it. The Gardaí needed to find out more before they went and accused Frank. They brought Frank in, asked him did he owe anyone money. The answer was no. He was contending that there was some kind of organisation after him, but couldn't give any details. The Gardaí determined that phone calls were made to both pubs, but they could never establish who made them and why. Interviews were conducted around Blessington, Rathfarnham and even the inner city. Criminal contacts of the Gardaí were asked if they knew a vendetta against 2 pubs in Blessington, and it came back a no. Gardaí were really starting to consider that Frank was not a victim of threats, but the source. On further investigation through the family and friends of Esther's, it was also revealed that on the 14th of August, Esther was asleep one morning, and an electric blanket was left folded at the end of the bed, plugged in, and had caught on fire. Esther was woke up by a phone call and saw the fire at the end of her bed. Frank entered the room as Esther was putting out the fire, and he yanked the plug out of the socket. The blanket was disposed of and so couldn't be examined by the Gardaí later on in the investigation. On another occasion, the brake fluid cable was cut in Esther's car. Neither of these incidents were relayed to the jury, as it was just hearsay. I haven't mentioned before, but there was a delay on the adoption of Jessica, and Esther didn't know why. She was constantly at Frank to contact the solicitors to find out what was going on. This went on for months. I know you are probably asking yourself, when exactly does one realise that someone is trying to kill you? From June to August, you had 4 gas leaks, brake cables cut, and an electric blanket goes on fire. I hear you. Well, after the electric blanket incident, poor Esther was mystified by these events and put herself into question rather than Frank. She was worried about herself and Jessica and losing her self-confidence, so she went to her doctor for help. By early September, she was getting back to her old self, and she spoke to her sister on the 3rd of September and told her she was going to get to the bottom of the adoption delays, and had an appointment the next day on the 4th to see them. Her mistake would be telling Frank that same evening. It was also discovered by Gardaí that our little Frank was leading a double life and was all about to come out. Surprise, surprise once again. And he had been laying the groundwork since June to kill Esther and Jessica to cover his tracks. As I said already, there was a delay on the adoption of Jessica, and Esther could not understand why. To her, they had dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, and still nothing. All Esther wanted was for Jessica to have her own identity and a sense of belonging, by legally being adopted into the family, because everything emotionally was already in place. Esther was not being told why the adoption was being delayed, but Frank knew why, as did their solicitor. This is going to take a minute to get there, so bear with me. You see, Frank was a successful competitive swimmer in the past, then a swimming administrator, then vice president of the Amateur Swimming Association, and he was aiming for president and then the top job of head of association. He had turned many a swimmer into champions, and the Olympics was coming up also, but he shared his success with two other men, which were coaches. These coaches were George Gibney and Derry O'Rourke. At the time of the fire that took Esther and Jessica's lives, it was about to come out that they were at the centre of a paedophile sex scandal involving their students, and Frank was right at the centre of it also. It had taken 10 years to come to light thanks to Frank, who either ignored the complaints or explained them away. So the complaints never went anywhere. The three were so close that they would visit Frank's house, and it was reported that they would be sitting in Frank's kitchen drinking tea, and if Esther walked in, they would go quiet. Later, Derry O'Rourke would be charged with 29 accounts of sexual abuse and rape against minors, and found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison in 1998. In 2005, he would be charged with further sex abuse and rape charges of other students, and sentenced to another 10 years. George Gibney fled the country in 1994 to avoid a conviction of 27 charges of abuse and rape, and the authorities didn't extradite him back to Ireland, and later the High Court decided to quash the charges as too much time had passed in order for a fair trial to be held for Gibney.
He was charged last year, but an order from the High Court prevented him from standing trial on the basis that the alleged offences had taken place too long ago to ensure a fair trial for Mr. Gibney.
Another give me strength moment. Nothing about justice for those poor children and parents who put their trust in these monsters. I know innocent until proven guilty, but at least put him on trial. What's even more sickening is Gibney was the original coach and Derry was hired afterwards as a replacement coach. What are the chances of two coaches being paedophiles? Obviously very high. So all this leads to Frank McCann's bit of scandal and what he was trying to hide from Esther, and why he felt the need to kill her and Jessica. Before Frank married Esther, he had a sexual relationship with a 16-year-old special needs girl that he was training, and lo and behold, she got pregnant, and at 17 she gave birth to a little boy in 1987. The same year Esther and Frank got married. This baby was given up for adoption, and an arrangement was made by Father Michael Cleary on behalf of the family of the girl. Frank was to pay a sum of £500 to £600 to the family of the girl. Of course, Father Michael Cleary had his own scandal that wouldn't come to light until after his death in December 1993. He allegedly had a 26-year secret, not so secret relationship with his housekeeper when she was 17 and he 34. They had two boys together, the first given up for adoption and the second they raised together. So when it came to the adoption of Jessica, the mother of the special needs child that Frank had fathered a child with, got wind of the adoption of Jessica, and so she put in a complaint with the adoption board in April 1992. And on July 28 the adoption was denied. It was a condition of the adoption board to inform Esther why it had been refused. The solicitor representing the McCanns was informed of the decision, and in turn he contacted Frank, but no one told Esther. It was said Frank was consumed by the adoption and determined that Esther and others would not find out why the adoption was denied. So Frank decided the most rational solution to keep his secret was to kill Esther and Jessica. I know, the mind boggles at this logic. After the death of Esther and Jessica, their family had the funeral for them in Esther's hometown. The relatives had to travel with the hearse from Dublin to Tramore in County Waterford. They stopped halfway to take a break, and Esther's nephew noticed Frank walking around the hearse talking to himself, which he found a bit strange. After the funeral, everyone was heading up to a family member's house for refreshments, and they passed a group of schoolgirls walking on the path. And Frank rolled down the window and shouted at them, "Hey girls, I'm free, I'm available." Like, what the fuck? This is just after he buried his wife and little Jessica. Sick sense of humour is putting it mildly. On the same day, rather than stay around in Tramore with the members of Esther's family and friends, Frank decided to head back to Dublin to his pub and hold a 60th birthday party for his mother. His mother didn't want the party, but Frank insisted it went ahead as he had organised it. He didn't see a reason why the party shouldn't go ahead. Days later, the house was handed back over to Frank and, of course, like Joe O'Reilly, invited family around for the tour. He brought them into the kitchen, the hallway, up the stairs, onto the landing, into the master bedroom and to little Jessica's bedroom where the cot was, and the shape of little Jessica where she lay could still be seen. Her dodie and bottle were still there. The whole cot was black except for where she had laid. They went back down the stairs and into the living room, and that's where Frank said, "I was thinking of putting an ad in the paper, some charcoal for sale," which no one found amusing bar himself. A week or two after that he went on holidays to America, but to the Gardaí this was odd behaviour and not typical for a man that was supposed to be grieving. It was obvious to Gardaí that Frank was a good candidate for murdering Esther and Jessica. All they needed to do now is piece it all together. They had the gas leaks, the cutting of the brake cables, the electric blanket incident and motive. Now all they had to do was put the timeline together of Frank's movements on the night of the fire. On the night of the fire, Frank heads back to the pub for 11 p.m. and the barman says Frank was still there at 1 p.m. when he left. The local chipper owner from next door to the pub, i.e. takeaway, said he had been in there before that at around 12:30 to 12:40 a.m. She then heard the gate of the pub creaking around 1 a.m. and she presumed that was Frank leaving. Witnesses saw Frank arrive at his home at around 1:30 a.m. The Gardaí tested how long it would take to get from the pub in Blessington to his home in Rathfarnham. They drove it twice, once in normal hours and another time after closing hours when the road would be quiet. It took 20 minutes. So the Gardaí estimated that Frank arrived around 1:20 a.m, entered the front door of the house, poured petrol in the hallway and on the stairs. With a gas cylinder and blowtorch, he set a fast and ferocious fire. He then left, returning to the house at 1:30 a.m. as the distraught husband. Frank was arrested at his pub on the 4th of November 1992 and held for 48 hours. At around midday on the 6th of November, he started his statement of admission. At 1:22 p.m. he was released as his 48 hours were up. But at 1:29 p.m. Frank returned to finish his admission statement on a voluntary basis. This was signed by 3 Gardaí and 2 of his brothers. After his statement he was charged with murder and arson. His trial started on the 11th of January 1994 and he pleaded not guilty. But it collapsed on the 31st of January 1994 after Frank poured deodorant over his head and set himself alight in Arbour Hill prison. The jury had to be dismissed and the trial suspended due to this, and Frank had to be evaluated to see was he mentally fit to stand trial. Was Frank insane or trying to undermine his own trial? 2 years later, Frank's second trial began on the 10th of June 1996 after being deemed fit, and it ran for 48 days. Frank sat in the trial calm, and when he was not speaking to his solicitors, he read a crime novel called Total Eclipse, which is about the perfect murder. How ironic. I swear he has the neck of a jockey's bollocks. The defence tried to get his confession thrown out on the grounds that it was made after the 48-hour hold, but the prosecution were able to show that Frank returned voluntarily to continue the statement, and so the judge allowed it. Frank ran rings around his legal team and did everything and anything to delay the proceedings. On the 48th day, the jury retired to deliberate the findings. Everyone was very tense as Frank came across as a mild-mannered man, a family man, and had a good reputation amongst the community. This perception of him divided the jury, and after hours they returned to the courtroom to seek guidance from the judge. Some of the jury were struggling with parts of the confession statement where Frank said, before he left the pub, he picked up baby Jessica and gave her a kiss and a cuddle. Could a man that showed such affection turn around hours later and burn her to death? The verdict had to be unanimous. The jury went back in again to deliberate and returned 20 minutes later with a verdict of guilty. Frank was given 2 life sentences to run concurrently in Arbour Hill Prison, Dublin. He has appealed his sentence once in 1996 and again in 1998. Obviously he didn't win. In 2005 he applied for the 3 years he served while on remand to be included in his sentence and he won. In 1998, Esther's mother took out a civil action against Frank so he would not profit from Esther's death. She won the first case of its kind in Ireland and was awarded half the net profit of 180,000 Irish pounds from the sale of the house. She was also awarded £27,900 of his share of the life insurance policy on the mortgage. The judge also directed Frank to pay £20,000 in legal costs for the application to recover Esther's estate. She also said the £50,000 owed on the mortgage that was to be paid was to come out of Frank's share and not Esther's. Also, Frank was to pay £9,300 under the Civil Liability Act for mental stress and funeral expenses. So basically, our little Frank gets sweet feck all. Oh, this makes my heart sing. So as of today, where is Frank? Before COVID, he was allowed out unsupervised to attend college. He has a degree and a PhD in computer science. He was trusted to clean the officers' quarters and cut the grass outside the walls of the prison. After spending the majority of his sentence in Arbour Hill, he was moved to Mountjoy Progression Unit after refusing to leave his cell. He didn't like the fact that his upcoming parole hearing was being discussed on national radio, and his fellow inmates throwing verbal taunts towards him over it was not to Frank's liking. He is up for parole soon and is likely that he will get it. It will be 30 years this September 2022 since Esther and baby Jessica perished in the fire that Frank set. I will leave you with the words of Esther that she wrote about her Jessica in her diary. My darling daughter Jessica, you have grown and become a beautiful child. You have been walking now for little over a week and have given up holding onto the wall, in search of your own bit of independence. Cup of tea, ups-a-daisy, with constant talk of daddy. Oh, mammy and mammy's baby. Lots of talk and every day brings new joys of every sort.